What did Paracelsus contribute to alchemy?
Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, shared the Neoplatonic beliefs of most alchemists. Decay is the beginning of all birth. Prime matter separates out of ultimate immaterial matter, and human creativity repeats this process. Time is a cycle composed of force and growing, and above and below, or heaven and earth, are the same in form. However, Paracelsus replaced the planetary theory of humors with a chemical one. Salt, sweet, bitter, sour, and the fifth element or quintessence life. His term ens natural referred to the balance of the chemical humors. And ens spiritual was the balance of the mind. Unlike many of his colleagues, Paracelsus did not think that insanity was caused by demons or that nightmares represented sexual intercourse with succubi. He taught that the mind can create diseases in itself. The body, or in the minds or bodies of others via hypnosis, magic, or ill will. He thought that most diseases are curable evils, but that no doctor can correct ens dei, or the will of God. Paracelsus was accused of heresy for his Neoplatonic notion of prime matter and for asserting that illness was not evil. Prime matter contradicted the idea that God created everything. Also, saying that illness was not evil left no room for the devil. But, after his death, his birthplace became a shrine for Roman Catholics.
What did Simone de Beauvoir mean by an ethics of ambiguity?
Beauvoir expressed a disappointment with politics after World War II. And she addressed the importance of mass action and relations between political party leaders and their followers and colleagues. She applied Jean-Paul Sartre's, 1905 to 1980, existential philosophy to politics, criticizing the spirit of seriousness that characterized those who did not take responsibility for their political actions as free individuals. Although Sartre had never written on ethics, she thought that ethical positions and decisions would arise from compelling passions and circumstances. The best interpretation of Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, is not that ethics is itself ambiguous, but that ethics is somewhat arbitrary from an existentialist perspective.
Did Plato change his philosophy as he grew older?
Plato became more conservative in his outlook and more attentive to existing social values and traditions as he aged. The city of the Republic would have required a revolution to set up. In the later laws, Plato becomes less revolutionary and describes a second-best city in which there are traditional families and rulers are elected, rather than specially bred. In the Parmenides, Plato offers a series of criticisms to his earlier theory of forms, which he is apparently unable to answer and which are later taken up by Aristotle. The most famous of these is the third man argument. Suppose we discover a form that accounts for what makes similar things similar. For example, every cat is different. But all cats share the same catness because they participate in the cat form. Now, if we compare this form with any one thing that participates in it in this case. Compare your cat with the cat form, the form and the participating thing will have similarities that make it necessary to posit a second form. If we then make comparisons of the cat to the second form, a third form will need to be posited, and on to an infinite regress. That is, Plato was aware of the theoretical problems with his theory of forms.
What are the issues addressed by Latino-Latina/Hispanic American philosophy?
Identity, immigration, the experience of multinational persons, and the nature of cultural difference are considered. As well, there are unique feminist issues for Latina Americans and questions centered on the difference between race, as false biology, and ethnicity, as culture.
Who were the Stoics and what did they believe?
Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, 334 to 262 B. CE, whose work was carried on by Cleanthes, 331 to 322 BCE. Who was then succeeded by Chrysippus, c. 280 to 206 BCE. The name Stoic came from the stoipoikil, or painted colonnade, where Stoics first gathered in Athens. According to these early Stoics, the entire world is a morally good organism, with different phases in which events operate according to divine reason, or logos. The sequence of events is predetermined by fate. Each world phase ends in a big fire and is then repeated in a continuous, never-ending cycle. Early Stoic ethics held that only virtue is good, and only vice is bad. Other things, such as health or wealth, may be preferred, but they are morally indifferent. We each have a unique role in the world plan and our job is to learn what it is. Such learning creates concern for the self, which can and should be extended to close relatives and friends and, after them, all humanity. The Stoics may have been the first cosmopolitans. Learning is based on assent to impressions. Until all of a person's thoughts become related and unassailable by reason. By counseling that we assent to impressions, the Stoics meant that we should not deny anything that is presented to us as either a fact or an opinion, but simply acknowledge its effect on us. Such Stoic certainty formed the dogmatism opposed by the skeptics.
What is ethical subjectivism?
Ethical subjectivism is either the same as ethical emotivism, or the view that ethical judgments express our shared emotions. Or else it refers to an individual's private moral views as the meaning of morality. So that in principle there could be as many moral systems as there are individuals.
What is philosophy of film?
Film criticism, both scholarly and popular, has a history as long as visual media. But philosophy of film, as a contemporary subfield in aesthetics, or philosophy of art, dates from the 1970s. As in other fields, the philosophy of film is similar to the theory of film undertaken by specialists in film or film studies. There are philosophers who, like film theorists and critics, specifically study film as a self-contained medium. Philosophical cultural critics who use film as evidence of broad beliefs in contemporary culture. And philosophers who turn to film for examples in ethics, aesthetics, political philosophy, feminism, and many other philosophical interests and subfields. As well, some films directly raise philosophical questions, such as the questions about what is real in The Matrix, 1999, and its sequels, and the nature of memory and identity raised by Memento, 2000, and the children's film The Never-Ending Story, 1984. There are, moreover, films that are directly about philosophy and philosophers such as The Easter, 2004, which is about Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976. Contemporary sources on philosophy and film include Richard Allen and Murray Smith, editors. Film Theory and Philosophy, 1997, Gregory Curry, Image and Mind, Film, Philosophy and Cognitive Science. 1995, and Cynthia A. Freeland and Thomas E. Wartenberg, Philosophy and Film, 1995. The online journal Film Philosophy, a philosophical review of film studies and world cinema is an ongoing source of contemporary work and additional sources.
What is Plato's simile of the cave?
Plato introduces the simile of the cave in the Republic to convey the power of the experience of forms and describe their importance. It is his metaphysics in a poetic nutshell. Imagine a cave where prisoners are chained to the wall and the only objects they can see are shadows of things carried behind a fire in back of them. If a prisoner is freed, he will first encounter the objects in the cave whose shadows he has seen before. If he ascends out of the cave, imagine his amazement when he sees these objects and the rest of the world, in full sunlight. Imagine also how his fellow prisoners might react if he attempts to relate what he has seen to them. The cave represents normal existence and perception, and the objects in sunlight are the world of the forms.
What was Johann Gottlieb Fichte's political philosophy?
In his Foundations of Natural Right, 1796, he supported individualism, but his views changed over time. His Speeches to the German Nation, 1808. Advocated concern for the common good and condemned selfish acts. He argued that egoism was untenable, morally, but that the German people could rise to a higher level because of the innate excellence of their character and language.
What are the pitfalls and promises of experimental philosophy?
In its degenerate forms, experimental philosophy could resemble philosophy by opinion poll. But that is not its goal or method. Rather, the view is that before relying on ordinary intuitions, philosophers should check what non-philosophers actually believe. That is, if philosophical theories depend on a certain view of intuitions, then philosophers should begin with the empirically accurate view. They should make sure that when they say the public thinks X, that the public does think X. The promise of philosophy is that experimental philosophy has the potential to make social and political philosophy more scientific. This does not deprive philosophers of the freedom to construct theories that explain why ordinary intuitions are incorrect, insofar as they are complex judgments and not mere expressions of taste. Recent work in experimental philosophy includes Joshua Knobe and Sean Nichols. Experimental Philosophy, 2008, Joshua Knobe, Intentional Action in Folk Psychology. An Experimental Investigation, in Philosophical Psychology, 16, 2003, N.K. Anthony Appiah, Experiments in Ethics, 2008. Critical responses to experimental philosophy include, Ernest Sosa. Experimental Philosophy and Philosophical Intuition, in Philosophical Studies. 132, 2006, Kirk Ludwig, The Epistemology of Thought Experiments, 1st vs. Third-Person Approaches, in Midwest Studies in Philosophy, 31, 2007, and Antti Kopinen. The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy, in Philosophical Explorations, 10, 2007.
What was the mission of the Vienna Circle?
The aim of the group was to restate ideas about both scientific knowledge and philosophy, and establish a form of philosophy that would be close to science, unlike German idealism. The members did not think that philosophy had a positive content of its own, or even a distinct epistemology or theory of knowledge. Rather, philosophy should study the knowledge methods and claims of science and justify them. For example, they thought that Albert Einstein's theory of relativity had shown that philosophers could not have the last word on either space or time, as Kantians believed. Arithmetic was believed to be reducible to logic, and synthetic a priori knowledge. Rational knowledge derived from thought alone that was true to experience, was unnecessary. The principle of verification, or verificationism, was their main tenet. Whatever claims to knowledge could not be verified in the sciences was simply not knowledge. The manifesto of the Circle was Wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung, der Wiener Kreis. The scientific conception of the world, the Vienna Circle, was published in 1929 and translated by Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, in his Empiricism and Sociology, 1973. The manifesto proclaims that the scientific world conception of the Vienna Circle is distinguished essentially by two features. First, it is empiricist and positivist. There is knowledge only from experience. Second, the scientific world conception is marked by the application of a certain method, namely logical analysis. Logical analysis is a way of using symbolic logic to determine whether sentences or their components refer to experience. Many logical positivists were also phenomenalists.
Was military invasion of Europe part of the religious practice of Islam during the medieval period?
Yes, but the Islamic religion was not opposed to Christianity. In fact, as one of three great religions of the book, Islam had much in common with Christianity, as well as Judaism. Its doctrine included a belief in one God, the importance of prayer, the idea of a church or brotherhood for all members of the religion, and the obligation to care for the poor. What was distinctive about Islam, in comparison to Christianity, was its rejection of the idea of the Catholic Trinity. Requirements of fasting and other forms of bodily purification on holy days, and the necessity for every Muslim follower to make at least one journey or pilgrimage to Mecca. The continual importance of God and homage to Old Testament prophets was shared with Judaism. Although, unlike Judaism, Islam had a positive conception of heaven.
How was Hume a man of contradictions?
Hume is famous for having written, "Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man." Hume described himself as a man of mild dispositions, of command of temper, of an open, social, and cheerful humor, capable of attachment, but little susceptible of enmity, and of great moderation in all my passions. During his last painful illness with cancer, when his friend Adam Smith (1723–1790) visited him, he was calm and had no regrets about his atheism. Nor did he desire to make a religious conversion in case there was an afterlife. He did in fact have a lifelong reputation of being pleasant and highly reasonable. He was known as the Good David, in England, and Le Bon David in France. but, concerning his moderation, Hume very much enjoyed fine food and drink and weighed over 300 pounds. And as for his mildness, his friendship with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, suggests otherwise. When Rousseau was given refuge in England, partly due to Hume's efforts, in 1766, Hume soon came to regret it. Although Le Bon Davide had enjoyed great fame in the salons of Paris, Rousseau was a world celebrity of greater wattage. Rousseau was also financially pressed and very sensitive to public opinion. He wore exotic costumes and was made fun of in state English society. Hume did nothing to temper this reaction. Rousseau soon became distrustful of Hume's friendship and accused him of perfidy. Instead of letting the matter rest, Hume published their correspondence. Going against the advice of his close friends, who were prepared to make allowances for Rousseau, because they knew how personally troubled he was. This publication, together with Hume's denial that he had himself leaked the letters, destroyed his friendship with Rousseau and incurred skepticism about his own goodwill, good sense, and underlying motives.
What is phenomenalism?
Not to be confused with phenomenology, phenomenalism is the empiricist doctrine that sense data, or the sensory organ's impression of perception, could be used to explain the meaning of sentences about perceptual objects. Some believed that perceptual objects themselves, such as a computer, a desk, or a car, could be reduced to sense data. This last ontological version of phenomenalism would involve a general commitment to philosophical idealism or the doctrine that the only things that are real are mental phenomena.
Did any of the early modern male philosophers consider the position of women in their writing?
Yes. René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, deliberately wrote his Discourse on Method, 1637, in French. In part so that women, who were not usually taught Latin, would be able to read it. Hobbes considered women to be just as strong and free as men in the original state of nature and talked about their consent being necessary to enter into marriage. He also referred to the power of women when he called them Lord Mothers, to whom their children were obligated if they had nurtured and raised them, instead of abandoning them to fortune. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, thought that the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which was based on heredity from Adam, simply left out the existence of female parents. He described marriage as a partnership for the sake of procreation and raising children and suggested that once children were grown the husband and wife could go their separate ways if they chose. In his Thoughts Concerning Education, 1693, written in response to his cousin's questions about how young men should be raised. Locke wrote that girls should receive basically the same education as boys.
Did Malebranche lead an exciting life?
If he did, it was in his inner life. To all outward appearances, Nicolas Malebranche was a scholar with the temperament of a religious recluse. He was born and died in Paris and throughout his life liked solitude. Malebranche was sickly as a child, born with a deformed spine and prone to respiratory problems. He was educated at home by a tutor until the age of 16. His father, Nicolas, was a royal councillor who managed the finances of 5 farms. His mother was sister to the Viceroy of Canada. Malebranche entered the Collège de la Marche of the University of Paris, receiving an MA in 2 years. After which he studied theology at the Sorbonne in Paris for another 3 years. He was ordained as a priest in 1665 at Faubourg Saint-Jacques. His family contributed to his support by the church, and he had no official duties beyond teaching mathematics in 1674. In 1690 the Church put his Traité de la nature et de la grâce, 1680, on the index of books that Catholics were forbidden by the Church to read because his claim that all of our ideas are in God was controversial, and because he'd been successful in spreading René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, mathematics. Descartes' writings were on the Church's index of forbidden books. So Catholics were forbidden to read them and they could not be taught in church schools. Although his most important work, The Search After Truth, 1674, won him wide acclaim, his students, such as Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, were considered of greater ability. Malebranche encouraged their research. In 1871, Alexander Campbell Fraser, a biographer of philosophers, wrote this account of how the young philosopher George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783, was the occasional cause of the death of Malebranche. Berkeley found the ingenious Father Malebranche in a cell, cooking in a small pipkin, an earthenware cooking pot that was positioned directly over a flame. A medicine for a disorder with which he was then troubled, an inflammation on the lungs. The conversation naturally turned on George Berkeley's, 1685 to 1783, system, of which he had received some knowledge from a translation just published. But the issue of the debate proved tragic to poor Malebranche. In the heat of the disputation, he raised his voice so high and gave way so freely to the natural impetuosity of a man of parts and a Frenchman, that he brought on himself a violent increase of his disorder, which carried him off a few days after.
What was Bernard Bosanquet's idealist doctrine?
Bosanquet acknowledged a tremendous debt to Friedrich Hegel's, 1770 to 1831, notion of the absolute, and was Modest about his own contributions to Hegelian philosophy, although they were a significant departure. According to Bosanquet, contradictions occur in experiences when there are opposing views of the same fact. Truth is attained by eliminating such contradictions by incorporating them into a larger picture. The totality of human experience contains all of such truths, and that is the absolute. It can be seen from this that Bosanquet had an empiricist interpretation of Hegel's view that itself was a contradiction. Bosanquet also held that the absolute contains all conflicting desires and satisfies all of them. The value of anything lies in its ability to satisfy desires. So the absolute is the standard of all values. We can best realize all of our desires by surrendering our particular forms of them to the absolute. This surrender is religious consciousness.
How did non-Euclidean geometry affect other fields?
The relationship between space and geometry changed forever in people's minds. Thanks to non-Euclidean geometry, the question arose of whether space itself was curved. This made the whole of geometry seem hypothetical and led some to question the possibility of a priori knowledge.
What is the school of thought of Buddhism?
The general structure of Buddhism as a school of thought is based on a religious belief in reincarnation, which is known as the will of life. The spiritual ideal is for the individual to stop being reincarnated by adopting behavior with the correct karma, or consequences. The will of life is propelled by the flame of desire. The main obstacle to enlightenment is thereby identified as desire. Desire for people, money, power, fame, objects, and anything else. By following the Eightfold Path, a practitioner will snuff out his or her flame of desire and no longer need to return to this earth. There are three precepts or self-evident truths: that all life is unhappy or unsatisfying, that all life is impermanent, and that there is no eternal or even permanent self or soul. From these precepts, the Eightfold Path manifests itself: right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right views, and right intentions.
What are some highlights of Friedrich Hegel's career?
Hegel was the eldest of 3 children. His father was a minor government official in the Duchy of Wittenberg. His mother died when he was 11. He attended the theological seminary or Stift, which was a subsidiary of the University of Tübingen. His roommates were the great German Romantic poet Johann Christian Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. 1775 to 1854, who would be his colleague and intellectual opponent. They disputed the importance of reason, with Hegel proudly affirming it and Schelling expressing a lack of enthusiasm for it. When he graduated, Hegel first worked as a tutor for a Bern family, and then he moved to Frankfurt. His father's death provided him with sufficient income to concentrate on his own scholarly work in hopes of getting a university position. His early interests were in reconciling fluid notions of reason with non-institutionalized Christianity. In 1805, Schelling assisted Hegel in moving to Jena, where he lectured for several years and became a professor at the University of Jena. By this time, as expressed in his early essays, Hegel was having doubts about the freedom promised by the Enlightenment. He loved the thought and ways of life of ancient Greece and believed that Enlightenment rights would result in new forms of repression. One motivation for this concern might have been his experience of the French Revolution. On a deeper philosophical level, he thought that what was most noble in human beings required society and government for its development. This view conflicted with the individual rights doctrine, which assumed that government was the enemy of natural human rights. At Jena, he co-edited the Critical Journal of Philosophy with Schelling, which was dedicated to exploring the consequences of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 transcendental idealism in light of Johann Gottlieb Fichte 1762–1814 and Schelling's own work. Hegel left Jena when the university closed after Napoleon Bonaparte's victory in October 1806. He then edited a pro-Napoleon newspaper in Bavaria and became headmaster of a Nuremberg high school in 1808. In 1807 Hegel's important Phenomenology of Spirit was published, and then his Science of Logic, 1812, resulted in a professorship at Heidelberg. In 1818 he assumed his last post, which was as a professor at Berlin, lecturing widely on philosophy of history, history of philosophy, aesthetics, and philosophy of religion, much of which was unpublished until it was posthumously compiled from his notes and those of students. Hegel's Foundations of the Philosophy of Right, Natural Right and Political Science in Outline was published in 1821.
Who was Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach?
Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach, 1804–1872, criticized German idealism as a form of theology, or a rationalization of religion. His project was to invert Friedrich Hegel's 1770–1831 relationship between the individual and the absolute. Whereas for Hegel, the individual was an effect or expression of the absolute. For Feuerbach the absolute was an effect or expression of the individual. Feuerbach's main works were, Toward a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy, 1839, The Essence of Christianity, 1841, Principles of the Philosophy of the Future, 1843, and The Essence of Religion, 1846. He collaborated with Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and was active in the late 1840s revolutionary period. But then retired from public life and died poor.
Who was Charles Sanders Peirce?
Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839 to 1914, is recognized as the founder and originator of pragmatism. Although his intellectual expertise extended to logic, mathematics, economics, social science, the physical sciences, and geodesic work. Peirce's published writings date from 1857 until his death and constitute 12,000 printed pages. There are, in addition, 80,000 pages of his unpublished handwritten work. His principal works, published posthumously, are edited volumes, such as The New Elements of Mathematics. 4 volumes, 1976, The Essential Pairs, 2 volumes, 1992 and 1998, and Writings of Charles S. Peirce, a chronological edition, 5 volumes, 1882 to 1993.
How did Aristotle's main ideas compare to Plato's?
Aristotle rejected Plato's claim that only the forms are real and that there is another world of forms outside of the world that we perceive in ordinary life. But he agreed with Plato that knowledge must have certainty. Therefore, his main philosophical task was to describe what made objects real in this world and explain how we can have certain knowledge about them. He also developed a system of logic, or rules of thought, that would guarantee certainty if one began with premises that were certain.
Has science removed all of the mystery of life?
Not exactly. The radical materialist idea that organisms are computations of their genes and environmental conditions has had critics. Most notably Richard Lewontin, 1929, in his Biology as Ideology. The Doctrine of DNA, 1991, and the Triple Helix, Gene, Organism, and Environment, 2000. Lewontin's main contribution has been to point out that seemingly random factors in the development of organisms, which cannot be predicted before the fact, are the third element in biological replication.
What did William Whewell mean by the sensationalistic school?
Whewell meant to belittle the view of empiricists who held that all knowledge was the result of sensory experience, or what Whewell thought was mere sensation.
What were Thomas Aquinas' main original ideas?
Although Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was deeply influenced by the work of the Aristotelians, as well as the Stoics, Neoplatonists, and St. Augustine, 354–430, his resolution of past philosophy with Christian theology is considered unique. Many of his solutions to standing problems display moderation without intellectual compromise. For instance, his position on universals. Whether or not general terms name general things that exist, is even called moderate realism. Aquinas did not believe that universals exist. But he did posit a foundation outside of the human mind for universals and truths about them. That foundation was the fact that individual things of the same kind, which are referred to by the name of that kind, e.g., specific cats that are called cats, have real similarities and resemblances. Whether or not this solution did more than restate the problem remains an open question. But it definitely impressed many as a new way of thinking about the old problem of universals.
How did Leibniz define his principles?
Leibniz based his philosophy on the following principles. The principle of identity. This is the law of necessary truth and non-contradiction. A is A and never not A. The opposite of a necessary truth is a contradiction. The principle of the best. A contingent truth can have an opposite that is not a contradiction. God, who is perfectly wise, good, and powerful, did not have to create the world. But he chose to do so, and because he chose it, it is the best possible world. The principle of sufficient reason. Everything that exists or occurs must have a reason that was sufficient to bring it about. Metaphysically necessary principles. Leibniz had a number of these, which included: everything possible demands to exist and it will exist unless prevented. Activity is essential to substance, and states of things remain unless or until there is a reason for them to change. Principles of order. These consisted of three laws of order: the law of continuity, the law that every action involves a reaction, and the law that cause and effect are equal. Efficient and final causation. Efficient causes are what immediately make things happen, whereas final causes are the ends or goals of higher substances. The entire realm of efficient causation is designed to serve the realm of final causation. Principle of the natural. Everything that God allows to exist and happen, he chooses from what is natural, otherwise he would constantly be performing miracles. What is natural is always in between what is essential or necessary and what is accidental.
Marx, 1818–1883, wrote to him after What is Property?
"1840, was published and they became friends in Paris, where Marx was then living in exile. But Marx responded to Proudhon's subsequent The Philosophy of Poverty. 1847, with the poverty of philosophy, 1880. The ensuing dispute divided the anarchists from the Marxists in the International Working Men's Association. Proudhon also had a dispute with Mikhail Bakunin's, 1814–1876, followers, who objected to his idea of workers' cooperatives and peasant ownership of land and factories after a peaceful revolution.
Who was R. Hare?
Richard Mervyn Hare, 1919–2002, was a professor of moral philosophy at Oxford University. And he later taught at the University of Florida. In his The Language of Morals, 1992, he argued for the prescriptive nature of moral judgments and their universalizability, or ability to be generalized. In Freedom and Reason, 1963, and Moral Thinking, Its Levels, Method, and Point, 1981. Hare held that ethical concepts are used according to logical rules that support the truth of utilitarianism. The utilitarianism propounded by Hare was two-tier, providing for both act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism requires that we do singular actions that will result in the best consequences, whereas rule utilitarianism requires that we follow rules that will result in the best consequences.
Who were the main early modern philosophers?
The customary division is between the rationalists and the empiricists. René Descartes, 1596–1650, Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, and Nicolas Malebranche, 1638–1715, are usually listed as the epistemological rationalists. Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, and John Locke, 1632–1704, as the empiricists. However, for a more complete picture, Francisco Suarez, 1548–1617, should be counted among the rationalists, and Hugo Grotius, 1583–1645, among the empiricists.
Who was Thomas Kuhn?
Thomas S. Kuhn, 1922–1996, became world famous for his idea that scientific progress requires new ways of looking at the world. He was educated at Harvard and taught at the University of California at Berkeley, Princeton University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He began as a physicist and then studied the history and philosophy of science. While teaching a course on physics to humanities students, he realized that Aristotle's 384–322 BCE Physics were not as wrong as commonly assumed, but rather made sense in their own intellectual context. His first book, The Copernican Revolution, 1957, explained the intellectual transition from Aristotelian geocentricism to the heliocentric theory. But it was Kuhn's second book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, that reverberated throughout intellectual communities. Because he showed how science proceeds by quantum leaps when new theories overthrow old theories. After Kuhn became very famous and attended a conference on his work, where everyone used his term paradigm almost as loosely as they do today, he is reported to have told someone, "I am not a Kuhnian."
What was Alexius Meinung's psychological theory?
Meinung divided mental experience into act, content, and object. He worked on the basis of Brentano's theory of intentionality, whereby all mental states intend objects. The mental act, or act element, is the way that the subject is directed toward the object. Whereas the specific content, or content element, is its focus in that case. For example, it is a different act to think of an apple versus to desire an apple. Thinking of an apple and thinking of a car is a difference in content. And going from one to the other is a change in focus. Meinung's object theory bypassed traditional ontology because as intended objects. In the sense of Franz Brentano 1837–1917, it was not necessary that all objects exist. In fact, Meinung stressed a bias toward existence in the history of metaphysics, which he called a prejudice in favor of the actual. Each object has a socion, or character, which is given through its nuclear features. Because objects truly possess their characters, even statements about non-existent objects can be true. Because how objects are is independent of their existence. For example, a pink unicorn is genuinely pink, even though unicorns do not exist.
Who is Luce Irigaray?
Luce Irigaray, 1932, was born in Belgium and attended Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic seminars in the 1960s. She is famous for having written, "Sexual difference is probably the issue in our time which could be our salvation if we thought it through, and one must assume the feminine role deliberately." Which means already to convert a form of subordination into an affirmation, and thus to thwart it. Irigaray's main writings include An Ethics of Sexual Difference, 1982, and J.E. 2, News, Toward a Culture of Difference, 1990.
What was Immanuel Kant's moral system?
Kant's moral starting point is the distinction between things that are instrumentally or hypothetically good because they have good consequences, and things that are good in and of themselves. The only thing that is good in itself is a goodwill or benevolence, without which every other gift of fortune can be just cause for resentment. Morality is for rational beings, and rational beings require principles of action. In the community of rational beings, or the kingdom of ends, actions are good if they are autonomous, which is to say freely chosen. According to Kant, a rational being is autonomous or self-ruling. The rules that a rational being uses to regulate himself are absolute, what Kant called categorical. Such rules are imperatives and are followed for their own sake. Hypothetical rules, by contrast, are followed in order to make something else happen. For example, do not harm innocent people would be a categorical rule, and eat your vegetables would be a hypothetical rule.
What is the story about Nigel and the spider?
While Nagel was working in William James Hall at Harvard University one summer, he noticed a spider that lived in the men's urinal. Every time the urinal flushed, the poor arachnid would make a mad dash for its life so as not to drown. Nagel was concerned about what would happen to it when classes were in session and the urinal was flushed with greater frequency. After long and careful deliberation, Nagel decided to liberate the spider. He carefully removed it from the urinal with a paper towel and placed it in a corner of the room. At first the spider did not move, and Nagel assumed it was getting its bearings. He left town over a holiday weekend, and when he returned the poor spider had still not moved. It was quite dry and quite dead. Nagel recounts this episode in The View from Nowhere, 1986. His implication seems to be that even the greatest compassion and best intentions may miss their objective due to a lack of understanding of the circumstances of another.
What was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's lasting influence?
Although his thought, along with that of other 19th-century anarchists, was neglected after World War I, some of Proudhon's social ideas remain influential in contemporary economic organization. Examples of this include the representation in management of workers in large industries, as well as cooperative housing units and food growing and buying projects.
What is a meme?
In The Selfish Gene, 1976, British evolutionary biologist, Professor and author Richard Dawkins coined the term as being on a par with gene. A meme, for instance, a tune, recipe, moral system, or style of dress gets passed on from one generation to the next via cultural interaction. Although memes are not usually held to be physically inherited the way that genes are, social biologists believe them to be subject to natural selection and mutation.
What were the main elements of Newton's scientific system and what did they have to do with God?
Newton, 1642 to 1727, used the model of Euclidean geometry to demonstrate the mathematical axioms describing the system of the world. He held that the world consisted of material bodies, or masses made up of solid corpuscles that were either at rest or that moved according to the three laws of motion. Preceding these laws of motion was a scholium, in which Newton stated the conditions of his entire system, which were absolute time, absolute space, absolute place, and absolute motion. For Newton, the universe itself was like one gigantic box that never moved. These absolutes were to become very important in contrast to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. According to Newton, God played an active role in his system in several ways. He was the first cause of the whole celestial system. He keeps the stars and planets from crashing into one another. He creates absolute space and time, and he corrects for irregularities in the movements of planets and comets, which might otherwise undermine the entire harmony of the cosmos. That is, for Newton, not only did God exist outside of nature as its immaterial and transcendent soul, but God was the real and practical ruler and regulator of the physical universe. He wrote, "And thus much concerning God, to discourse of whom from the appearance of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy." This was religious science in religious times.
Why was Pythagoras important?
Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, is credited with inventing the word philosophia. He was born in Samos but settled in Croton, where he founded a brotherhood that was a school, a way of life, and a set of religious and political beliefs. Pythagoras discovered that the musical interval marked by the four fixed strings on seven-string lyres could be explained by ratios of the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. This was an important realization that forms the basis of the concept of harmony in music. Pythagoras went on to explain how number systems correspond to natural phenomena such as the movement of celestial bodies. Pythagoras' insight about mathematics is relevant today, because mathematics is the language of modern physics. Pythagoras and his followers also had a great interest in numerology and theories of the mystical significance of numbers. They embraced music as the spiritual side of number and believed that the right practices in daily habits and diet, as well as playing musical instruments, could enable them to hear the music of the stars and planets. They were strict vegetarians, except for a prohibition against eating fava beans.
What were some noteworthy advances in medicine during the scientific revolution?
During the scientific revolution, William Harvey, 1579–1657, correctly described and demonstrated the closed circulatory system of blood. Robert Burton, 1577–1640, described, and lived out, the nature of psychological depression. With Harvey's achievement, the inside of the human body could be understood as an orderly mechanical, hydraulic system. With Burton's achievement came the recognition of mental illness as a secular, pedestrian process. Both achievements were practical and gratifying rewards for scientific investigators, as well as their public.
What was the dial?
The name for this publication was suggested by Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799–1888, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882. The simile was explained in the first issue this way. And so with diligent hands and good intent we set down our dial on the earth. We wish it may resemble that instrument in its celebrated happiness, that of measuring no hours but those of sunshine. Let it be one cheerful rational voice amidst the din of mourners and polemics. Or to abide by our chosen image, let it be such a dial, not as the dead face of a clock. Hardly even such as the gnomon in a garden, but rather such a dial as is the garden itself, in whose leaves and flowers the suddenly awakened sleeper is instantly apprised not what part of dead time, but what state of life and growth is now arrived and arriving. The dial became dormant in 1844, but was revived for a year in 1860. In 1880 it reappeared as a political magazine, and in 1920 as a literary modernist magazine, publishing essays, poetry, and art reviews until 1929.
What was Immanuel Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative?
According to Kant, all rational beings are intrinsically valuable. And in the kingdom of ends, no one is a means to the end of anyone else. In the world of affairs what we do and who we are have prices. But in the kingdom of ends there are no prices, only dignities. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is that one must always act to treat humanity either as another person or oneself, as an end and never as a means. In other words, don't use people.
Why did Heraclitus disagree with Pythagoras about the essence of life?
Heraclitus, c. 540–480 BCE, thought that the essence of life was an inconclusive battle of opposites. The logos, or rational ruling principle of the cosmos, which takes on the form of fire and is equal to soul or life, is a constant. Within the logos, the strife of individual beings brings constant change.
Did Martin Heidegger owe a philosophical debt to Immanuel Kant?
Very much so, particularly in his phenomenological analysis of space and time. Like Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, Heidegger thought that both space and time were in the subjects as necessary preconditions for experience. But unlike Kant, Heidegger did not believe that space and time were necessary categories in the mind. Rather, they were ontological structures of human existence that became evident in the way Dasein concretely existed.
Why were Locke's views on religion influential?
Locke held a common-sense view of religion and advised toleration of competing sects within Protestantism. His toleration did not extend to Catholicism, however. Although that did not diminish its force within the Protestant community. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, 1695, he allowed for the validity of revelation, but only insofar as it did not violate previously accepted facts or beliefs. He suggested that the Church of England could be reformed to attract dissenters by diminishing the power of its bishops, eliminating all mysteries, rituals, and superstitions in belief, and reducing its creed to simply an acknowledgement of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. In his letter on toleration, 1689, Locke argued against religious persecution of all kinds or any laws that interfered with those religious practices that would be lawful if they were not specifically religious. Part of his argument was the pragmatic one that suppression of religious beliefs unnecessarily breeds rebellion. His overall endorsement of toleration, particularly on the part of government, was to have a later influence on the separation between church and state in the U.S. Constitution.
How did Prodicus make his living?
Prodicus, b. 460 B.C.E., a sophist, was an ambassador for his home city of Ceos. He traveled widely and became rich from his exhibitions. One of his specialties was distinguishing between synonyms, and Socrates claimed in Plato's Protagoras and Meno to have been his student. Prodicus had two versions of his talks, the 1 drachma lecture and the 50 drachma lecture. Socrates joked that he would have been more learned about words if he'd been able to afford the 50 drachma lecture. The 1 drachma lecture had much larger audiences, but, according to Aristotle, Prodicus sometimes gave the larger audiences a bargain by slipping in the 50 drachma lecture for them. If Aristotle's story is true, scholarly commentators have overlooked the possibility that the sophists invented modern sales techniques.
What was Bertrand Russell's theory of knowledge?
Russell distinguished between two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge by acquaintance was direct knowledge of sense data, mental states, thoughts, and feeling. More indirect knowledge by description was ultimately based on knowledge by acquaintance. For example, I have knowledge by acquaintance of this page as I am typing it into my computer. But knowledge by description of Burma, where I have never been.